14.3 brings some heavy nerfs, but also some wild buffs. For example, both Twin Terror and Executioner are getting heavy nerfs to directly address how oppressive Twin Terror Executioner has been. There's also a huge nerf to Set, which drastically reduces his tankiness. Meanwhile, there's a huge buff to augments like Starter Kit and Switching Gears, where they'll grant more gold. But there is a massive bug with Switching Gears that I'll get to in a moment. There's also mana buffs to Caitlyn and TF, where they'll need one auto fewer to cast. But most importantly, both Lux and Jax are getting buffs, which is extremely scary, especially in the comp I'll show you later. Although one change I don't understand is the 1 to Z, which looks like a nerf, but apparently it's a buff. What I can tell is runes will feel much better with this buff. But which of the other buffs should you be looking out for? What are the other incoming nerfs? And why will this Lux comp completely take over the meta? Before we get into that, if you want to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe. So firstly, I want to talk about Switching Gears because the buff is really good and I personally always take it if I get offered it. And through that, I've discovered an interaction which I think is a bug. Specifically, the augment reads that when you break your streak, you get 3 gold, right? Well, that also seems to count the neutral rounds in stage 1 as well. So if you win at 2-1, you won't get any gold, but if you lose at 2-1, then you do. So if you take this augment, you always want to lose at 2-1 because the game thinks you won the previous round at neutrals. And by perfectly winning and losing in stage 2, you can earn up to 17 gold just through the augment, and that's not including the interest intervals you hit sooner. If you include those intervals, then by 2-5 you'll be getting around an extra 25 gold, which is insane. The same reasoning is why the buff to Starter Kit is really good, because now you can hit the interest intervals much sooner. There's also bigger buffs to other augments like Bigger Shot and Endless Hordes, which should actually make them decent takes. But with that, let's talk about some of the bigger changes to the units in this patch. Firstly, Jhin is getting some much needed buffs, but these ones are a bit unconventional where they're just increasing his tankiness. But this buff will stop Jhin from getting one-shot by Ezreal and Lux. Tona is also seeing buffs to a headliner bonus, and her heal form is also seeing buffs. If you played set 10 back on the PvE, then this buff is actually a partial revert to what she was back then, although the shield duration is way down. So while it definitely won't be nearly as impressive as it was back then, this Sona buff now makes heal form Sona really strong, especially when you pair it with Illaoi. But moving on, as I mentioned, both Caitlyn and TF are getting mana buffs. This buff to Caitlyn is good, especially when paired with a Shojin, and she'll be outputting a lot more damage as she'll be ulting far more often. But I don't think this will be enough to make her S tier, she'll just be a more viable option in your level 8 rolldowns. But because of this buff, I find Caitlyn to be a better item holder for 5 costs like Jhin or Lucian. I understand why they're not buffing Caitlyn too much since 8-bit would be too strong, especially when paired with Riven. However, I feel like there could have been a buff to Caitlyn's AP ratios to make splashing Caitlyn with items like GS or Guardbreaker feel much better. Having said that, both Garen's and Senna's AP ratios are getting buffed, so a Senna and Garen 3 may give enough room for Caitlyn to do her thing. If you want to see a fun way to play around Garen, then check out my guide. Anyway, while Twisted Fate is getting buffed, I still think he'll be terrible in this patch in a disco setup because of the Lux buffs. Lux hard counts as disco, and this buff to TF is nowhere near enough to offset that. Likewise, there's a Karthus adjustment again, where his first 2 casts are weaker, but each successive cast is stronger as he'll be gaining more AP per cast. So Karthus being stronger also in turn means that again, Disco is weaker. Although there are nerfs to Mordekaiser's damage, which should make a headliner Mordekaiser stack much slower, but he will still be just as tanky, so it's not really that huge of a nerf. There's bigger nerfs to KO where she'll be losing 5% attack speed on her headliner bonus, and her shred is getting reduced all the way down to 20%. This reduction in her utility is a massive nerf because now you may need items like Shiv and Ionic Spark to get through big frontlines. Speaking of frontline, both Olaf and Vi are seeing nerfs to weaken their early game power, but these nerfs won't make that much of a difference with either 6 Bruiser or a stacked Punk. But what will make a massive difference is the nerf to Set, where he's losing a lot of base HP, especially when you combine that HP with Bruiser and items. Right now, Set is just too splashable in many comps, and he was too reliable as frontline in those comps or in a Heartsteel board. This nerf directly tackles that problem, but for me it kills any Set reroll dreams I had. And lastly, let's talk about the buffs to Jax and Lux. Now, the reason why these buffs are scary is because there already exists an amazing Lux comp where you spam bruises as your frontline. If you want to see a guide on how to play this comp, I'll link Throwdown's guide and another Reddit guide in the description. Throwdown's guide is incredibly detailed, so definitely give that a watch. But one thing I'll emphasize with this comp is that 6 Bruiser is a huge win con for Lux because it's so much HP to get through, and that buys a lot of time for Lux to scale, especially when you build purely damage items on her. If you actually check the stats, her average placement and win rate skyrocket when you play 6 Bruiser. Now the biggest problem with Bruiser Lux is that it isn't very counterable, since triple damage item Lux one-shots the backline and she doesn't really need any casting items because of the EDM procs. The only counters I can think of are ones with backline access through Karthus Akali or Ezreal, especially since Ezreal and Akali can kite Lux ults. However, Bruiser Lux will counter Karthus as you eventually play Alawi, and if Akali or Ezreal ever get caught in a Lux ult, then they're just dead. And even if Ezreal, Karthus or Akali manage to live, Lux has enough HP to tank their abilities. And since these comps barely stand a chance against Lux, there's no way that Disco can even be remotely viable against it, especially since Disco is still just as reliant on hitting Ziggs. The buff to TF is completely overshadowed by the buffs to Lux and Jax. Now I would say that the Twin Terror comp may have a chance with all the insane burst it has, but both Executioner and Twin Terror are directly getting pretty huge nerfs, so that won't be the case. Likewise, 6 Punk is also getting nerfed, so the Punk or Executioner units can just get one-shot by units like Lux and Karthus. I've played a lot of games of Bruiser Lux on the PvE and I have not lost a single time. I even beat Mortdog with this comp and he said this afterwards.
Yeah, I don't know about this Lux buff Keaton put in. We'll see. But I don't know, I still don't know how you ever beat this Lux. That's just so much damage.
But the biggest change to the meta is the following. Bruiser Lux is way stronger now, and with Set being less tanky, Heartsteel is slightly weaker. While Karthus is stronger after his second cast, he may not delete any units until then and get the benefits from Pentakill. So if his frontline isn't strong, Karthus won't be able to scale. He will still outscale units like Twisted Fate, but now Karthus will be really weak into melee comps that can threaten him before his third cast, like Edgelords and Crowd Divers. And both Kayle and Mordekaiser will be outputting less damage. So overall, Karthus and Pentakill are stronger into ranged carries, but weaker into melee. But Vertical Executioner has far less damage, and Twin Terror is much weaker. While the buffs to Senna are promising, she and units like Lulu have a big problem where they have insane damage, but their frontline is almost non-existent. Meanwhile, switching gears and starter kit are instant takes for me. But overall, the meta isn't going to change that much, bar Lux being extremely oppressive. In my opinion, Lux did not need a buff at all, so to see a buff to both Lux and Jax is very confusing to me. And with that, this will be another patch where Disco is unplayable. But I am hoping that the nerf to Set comes with a nerf to Heartsteel as well. And I still don't know exactly if the change to Zed is a buff or a nerf. I guess we'll have to see. But with that, I will pass over the questions to you guys now. What do you think of this patch? Are you glad Twin Terror and Executioner are getting nerfed? Do you think Lux needed a buff? And what is going on with Zed? Let me know in the comments and remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me, and as always, thank you for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.